Today's text comes from Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Hear the word of the Lord. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. How often have we heard that nothing is free? You can't get something for nothing. There is no free lunch. We must work hard and earn everything we have. Those are messages that we hear so often. They tend to bleed over into all areas of our lives. They impact the ways we relate to one another. They impact how we evaluate one another's motives. They impact our notions of God, forgiveness, grace, and love. We readily accept the idea that we need a bargaining chip to gain God's favor. What will it take for us to accept grace that gives of itself freely, with no strings attached? Jesus' disciples had been arguing over standing, position, and prominence. They had struggled against Jesus' teaching that wealth, power, and status did not carry over into the values of God's reign. They'd failed to understand that God's way was a polar opposite to how society wielded power, force, and control. They could not grasp that God desired to bless without condition, without cost, and ignoring all those issues of our becoming worthy or proving ourselves. Then Jesus came upon Bartimaeus sitting by the roadside on the route from Jericho. Bartimaeus had no bargaining chip. He was rather much like the children that had been brought to Jesus by their parents who sought Jesus' blessing for them. The only real difference was that Bartimaeus could speak. In fact, it was his speaking that claimed Jesus' attention in the first place. He was sitting by the road to beg as his blindness did not allow him to actively participate in society and its economic structures. He was not able to contribute to life around himself. Apparently, his blindness had come about by some accident or illness like conjunctivitis, for he did at least own a cloak, something he used to protect himself from the elements. This was a man who had lost any standing that he had held in society. Life was passing him by, and he was relegated to hearing the crowds that proclaimed Jesus, the crowds that walked the road beside him. Then he discovered that the reason the crowds were there was because of Jesus. At one point, Bartimaeus may have had some sort of standing. He might have wielded some degree of power or influence. He could have been one of the movers and shakers of society, but no more. On hearing that Jesus was nearby, however, he did all he could to gain Jesus' attention. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. While the crowd rebuked him in an attempt to silence Bartimaeus that they might hear anything Jesus had to say, he simply yelled all the louder, making the words his battle cry, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The crowd was none too happy with him. All the ruckus he was making, they tried repeatedly to shush him, to silence him, until finally Jesus heard him and called Bartimaeus to himself. At that point, the crowd shifted and helped Bartimaeus reach Jesus. Throwing off his cloak, he made his way as rapidly as possible to throw himself down at Jesus' feet. That cloak was the only thing of value that he really had. Rather than cling to it, however, Bartimaeus focused all his energy on getting to Jesus. He arrived empty-handed. He fell at Jesus' feet in reverence, submission, and expectation. Jesus asked him a strange question. What do you want me to do for you? If any question should have had an obvious answer, this one would be it. What else would a blind man come seeking from Jesus with the words, have mercy on me? Jesus' question here, however, was the same question that he had just recently asked the disciples who had come begging Jesus to do their bidding. What do you want me to do from you, for you? In the case of the disciples, they wanted power, status, authority. Bartimaeus simply wanted the opportunity to participate once again in the life of his society. He wanted the ability to contribute once more to life around him. He wanted to re-enter life with the vision that was necessary for his integration and wholeness. For that, he had nothing to offer. He cast his cloak aside. He had no standing. He had been reduced to begging for survival. He arrived at Jesus' feet empty-handed with a desperate need. He wanted something for nothing. He knew he had no way to repay Jesus or curry his favor. Jesus knew the same. That's why Jesus had called him to begin with. He wanted to demonstrate for his disciples that God's grace meets us at the point of our need, not from our value, worth, deemed importance, or power. I grew up with this notion that I must contribute to society around me in order to have worth. I needed to use my gifts, skills, and abilities for the welfare of those around me. In so doing, I could repay the gifts, kindness, and provision extended to me as I was growing up. Well, no one ever came out and said that. But it was an undercurrent, the subtext I could not miss, and the expectations placed on adults all around me. Children were exempt from paying their way. The adults were expected to make up for it. By contrast, my grandparents were rather vocal about not wanting their children and grandchildren to be required to do the same kind of hard work that they had been doing all their lives. Sure, they wanted them to be productive participants in society, but that participation was not supposed to be a struggle. It was a confusing mess of expectations that were only partly spoken and applied haphazardly to people around me. Some were held more to the standard of working hard to produce and gain a sense of belonging. Others were given more latitude and offered every advantage to make their lives easier. No one tried to unpack that for me. We just lived with competing narratives about what one brought to the table and how one actively participated in society. The element in all that remained unspoken was how God interacted with us along these lines. It was as though God's design for human interaction in society had no bearing on this equation. Then Jesus comes on the scene in his interaction with Bartimaeus. He asks and makes absolutely no demands of Bartimaeus. Jesus asks him what he wants. Jesus draws up no contract to obligate Bartimaeus in any way. Jesus places no conditions on their interaction. Jesus makes no demands on this man, requests nothing of him. He just asks what Bartimaeus desires. Then I imagine Jesus glancing meaningfully at his disciples before saying, "Go, your faith has made you whole." Jesus knew Bartimaeus had nothing with which to bargain for his healing. Jesus didn't even ask him to pay it forward. The only bargaining chip Bartimaeus had was the only one that mattered to Jesus. He was in need. Nothing else in those narratives I grew up with about one's place and contribution to society mattered to Jesus. His concern was more akin to that of my grandparents expressing their will that their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would live a life that was a whole lot easier than had been their experience growing up and rearing their own. That's the thing about grace. Grace wants what is best for us, what is best for others. It's not looking for repayment. It's not seeking for us to prove our worth. It's not engaged in bargaining or seeking personal benefit for the giver. Rather, it seeks to meet the needs of the other that both might rejoice in a more abundant life of shared blessing. Peter and the other disciples were still worried about how they would benefit from following Jesus. Jesus wanted to give up on their bargaining chips. Can we do the same? If we embrace grace, what good is a bargaining chip anyway?